Good evening, everyone. I bring greetings from AOGD. It's my privilege and pleasure to be a part of this virtual clinical monthly meeting at Lady Harding Medical College. Holi is around the corner, and we wish happy Holi to each and every member of AOGD. Be safe. Corona cases are rising, and we have to really be very careful while we do our work. Today is a special day because after the clinical meeting, we are handing over virtually to Dr. Achla Batra and Dr. Jyotna Suri, our incoming president of AOGD and vice president of AOGD. So we request everyone to stay on after the clinical meet for this virtual handover ceremony. I request Dr. Mamta Dagar to present the secretary's report.
On behalf of AOGD, I welcome you all to this AOGD virtual clinical meeting being organized by Lady Harding Medical College. And I shall be going through the secretary's report. As you know, today is the last and the 13th virtual clinical meeting of our tenure, and in which Lady Harding got the chance, in fact, had the opportunity to present twice because there was no clinical meeting which could be held in the month of March 2020 due to start of COVID pandemic. And so far, there had been 5 executive meetings in our tenure. Last was the hybrid executive committee meeting, which was held on 18th February at Gangaram Hospital. This is the list of AOGD events held in the month of February and March since our last clinical meeting was there. And as you see, almost all were virtual events in the form of webinars and ECMEs. On 27th February, there was a CME on women's health, on UTI in women, and nuances of antibiotics in gynae surgery being organized by Institute of Obs and Gynae under aegis of AOGD, Sir Gangaram Hospital. On 27th February, there was a webinar on breast and cervical cancer prevention by Breast Cancer and Cervical Cancer Screening Committee of AOGD. And on 3rd March, virtual quiz on critical care in obstetrics was organized by Institute of Obs and Gynae, Sir Gangaram Hospital. And as you know, the winners of this quiz will represent in the Foxy Usha Krishna quiz, which is going to be held in the month of April. And we congratulate to the winners of this quiz, Dr. Harshiba and Dr. Neha Khatri, both from Maulana Azad Medical College and LNJP Hospital. Congratulations once again to the winners of this quiz. On 5th March, there were FAQs on multi-micronutrients in pregnancy under aegis of AOGD. On 6th March, there was a webinar on providing quality care in abdominal malformations organized by Fetal Medicine Subcommittee and Quality Improvement Committee of AOGD. From 6th to 8th March, Foxy screening camps and awareness drive on preventable cervical and breast cancer was held on the occasion of International Women's Day. It was a mega event which spread from 5th to 8th March. And almost all the societies of Foxy had participated in it. AOGD had significantly contributed in the screening of cervical cancer and breast cancer. In Delhi, total 1,691 women were screened, of which LBC and pap smear were done in 1,288 women, HPV in 221 women, and via screening was done in 182 women. On 8th March, FAQs on ovulation induction were presented. On 16th March, there was a talk on FAQs on female sexual disorders. On 18th March, there was ECME on a maternal health quality improvement initiative, which was organized by Multidisciplinary Committee of AOGD. On 18th March, again, FAQs on HIV and in pregnancy were organized. On 24th March, webinar on placenta accreta spectrum was held, which was organized by Safe Motherhood Committee of AOGD. On 25th March, there was a CME on fertility management being organized by AOGD. And these are the forthcoming events which are known to us so far. On 27th March, there is ECME on anemia in pregnancy. This is tomorrow, which will be organized by Multidisciplinary Committee of and Safe Motherhood Committee of AOGD. And on 2nd April, there are FAQs on care of pregnant women under the aegis of AOGD. Next monthly clinical meeting will be on 23rd April, which will be organized by Apollo Hospital. AOGD and we congratulate once again to the newly elected AOGD subcommittee chairpersons and co-chairpersons for the year 2021 to 2023. And these are congratulations to Dr. Angela Aneja, Chairperson, Endometriosis Committee, Dr. K. Aparna Sharma as co-chairperson, and Dr. Jyoti Bhaskar as Dr. Aparna Sharma as chairperson, and Dr. Jyoti Bhaskar as co-chairperson for Quality Improvement, Obstetrics and Gynae Practice Committee, Dr. Sunita Malik for chairperson of Oncology Committee, Dr. Geeta Mediratta for chairpersons of Urogynecology Committee, Dr. Anita Rajoria as chairperson, and Dr. Sujata Das as co-chairperson for Adolescent Committee of AOGD, Dr. Surveen Guman as chairperson, and Dr. Deepthi Goswami as co-chairperson of Reproductive Endocrinology Committee of AOGD, Dr. Manju Puri as chairperson of Safe Motherhood Committee, Dr. Seema Thakur as chairperson, and Dr. Sangeeta Gupta as co-chairperson of Fetal Medicine and Genetics Committee, and Dr. Kanika Jain as chairperson of Endoscopy Committee. So with this, I come to an end by a very famous quote of Semisonic that every new beginning comes from some other beginnings end. And thank you very much to all the viewers. And now I hand over the floor to Dr. Manju Puri for further clinical proceedings. Over to you, ma'am.
Very good evening to all. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you for this AOGD monthly clinical meeting. So for this meeting, we plan 3 presentations for you all. The first would be on indiscriminate use of folic acid. We've done a lot of work on this for the past 10 years. And we thought that we'll share our experience, and then let's kind of revisit as to what we are doing is correct or not. Second would be a rudimentary horn. We'll be talking, sharing a few cases of rudimentary horn, where inaction at primary surgery is seen as to, how do we go about that dilemma of how to manage it. And then flash glucose monitoring, a new paradigm in monitoring glycemic control in pregnant women with diabetes mellitus. So these are the 3 presentations which we are going to share. So the first presentation will be made by Dr. Kanika, who is an assistant professor with us, and she would be making the first presentation. So I'll share the screen and Kanika would be here too.
Good evening, one and all. Let's start today's discussion with a very important topic, that is an indiscriminate use of folic acid among women of reproductive age group. And definitely it's a time to revisit. Terms folic acid and folate are often used interchangeably. Folate, it is a water-soluble vitamin that occurs naturally in food, and folic acid is a synthetic form of folate. Folate, it occurs naturally in several foods, including beef, liver, leafy vegetables, peas, beans, avocado, and it occurs in eggs and milk as well. Folic acid is available in multivitamins, prenatal vitamins, and is pure folic acid supplement added to food for fortifications and even in OCPs. Vegetarians are usually folic acid replete, but B12 deficient. So what is the importance of folic acid? It is an important factor in DNA synthesis, its stability and integrity, and is also required in the DNA repair. Folate metabolism requires B12 as a cofactor, and in the presence of B12 deficiency, folate is not metabolized and can result in aberrations of DNA synthesis and the repair. So this imbalance can also play an important role in disease emergence through aberrations in genetics and epigenetics that will be explained in subsequent slides. So what is happening? In a mother who's pregnant, various environmental risk factors like diet, which includes imbalance between the folic acid and B12 levels, then patients with gestational diabetes mellitus or who are obese, in patients who have external stress like in various environmental factors, even pollution to that matter, smoking, alcohol, and endocrine disruption, it leads to abnormality in the reproductive cells of the patient, not only of the patient, but also of the fetus in utero. And this is then transferred to the further generation that is known as the transgenerational transfer of the problem. So what happens is there is alteration of the epigenome marks which further leads to aberration of the gene expression because of the messenger RNA changes and also of the changes of the other components of the RNA. So this transgenerational development outcomes, it leads to alteration of the physiological and the behavioral adaptation. And that is why it can lead to growth restriction in the fetuses. Then it can lead to high susceptibility to various cancers that will be discussed in subsequent slides, but it is the breast cancer and even the memory cancers in the offsprings. Then it leads to a multitude of metabolic disorders in the fetus and also in the subsequent generations. Then it can even lead to alteration of the memory function, anxiety, neurological development, and even autism and Down syndrome is related to the same theory. Alteration of the expression of the imprinted genes and other biological processes also leads to all these abnormalities, which can be defined because of the presence of this epigenetic aberration. So what is epigenetic? It is defined as the changes in the periphery of the DNA. By this, I mean that DNA methylation. So we are not changing the sequence of the DNA, but there is alteration in the phenotypic variation or the expression of the DNA. So the changes could be because of many reasons that I already explained, that it can be environmental factor changes like dietary changes. As I told, the imbalance between the vitamin intake, that is folic acid is more and B12 is deficient. Then there can be smoking, alcohol consumption, and many others. And this DNA methylation and epigenetic alteration, it alters the expression of the gene. So why it is needed? Folic acid supplementation in women of reproductive age group is indicated as a universal periconceptional supplementation to prevent neural tube defects. And high dose prophylaxis are required for those patients who are at high risk of neural tube defects. And these include women with either parental history or personal history of entities. Then there can be women who are on anti-epileptic agents like valproic acid or carbamazepine. Then women on other drugs that reduce folic acid activity like sulfasalazine and trimethoprim. Then there can be a multitude of maternal conditions, which include decreased absorption or increased clearance of these vitamins. And it includes irritable bowel disease, celiac disease, and even bariatric surgeries. And women with diabetes mellitus, because they are themselves at high risk of developing neural tube defects. So what is the recommended dose for the prevention of neural tube defects? So it is 0.4 milligram per day according to ACOG 2017 guidelines. And it is said that in patients who are not at high risk, as I already explained in my previous slide, the supplementation should start at least a month prior to pregnancy and continue up to 12 weeks of gestation. But women who are at high risk, who have already had a pregnancy with neural tube defect or have a family history of neural tube defect should be given 4 milligram per day of the folic acid, and in women with other risk factors should be prescribed 1 milligram per day of this medicine, and supplementation should start at least 3 months prior to pregnancy and continue up till 12 weeks of gestation. So this dose of folic acid should be then thereafter reduced to 0.4 milligram per day after 12 weeks of gestation. But what is the scenario in India? In routine practice, we prescribe 5 milligram per day to all women who are attempting pregnancy, and we continue the same dose till 12 weeks of gestation, reducing the same thereafter to 0.5 to 1.5 milligram per day. And it is around 12.5 times higher than the recommended dose of 0.4 milligram. And it is a matter of discussion. The reason is that it is available and in this form, and then there's a lack of knowledge of the possible harmful effects of high dose of folic acid intake. And this is all in the presence of majority of our population being vegetarian, and hence they are folate deplete and B12 deficient. So is it okay to give folic acid in such high doses? Answer to it is no. As already stated by Plato, the excessive increase of anything causes a reaction in the opposite direction. And we found that in many studies that have already been done on the effects of high intake of folic acid. And it showed that there is appearance of unmetabolized folic acid in plasma and high intake of folic acid in the presence of vitamin B12 deficiency. It makes the offsprings at high risk of type 2 diabetes. Then various animal studies have shown that high intake of folic acid is associated with increased risk of carcinogenesis. Then a study has also shown that there is increased risk of fetal anomalies because of the extra intake of folic acid. and it is associated with tumorigenesis. Other study also stated that with increased risk of breast cancer and also increased risk of mammary tumors in the offsprings. Along with it, there is increased risk of development of non-colorectal cancers and intrauterine growth retardation. So a study which was done in our institute in which around 100 patients were taken and the trends of folate B12 levels were seen in the different trimesters of pregnancy and their outcomes were measured. We found that in patients who were not taken any supplementation prior to this, we took the blood sample, we found that around 97% were folate replete with B12 deficiency seen at around 60% of the cases. So what is the potential risk of high dose of folic acid supplementation? Unrecognized B12 deficiency with the imbalance between folic acid and B12 levels, it results in epigenetic alteration and its related effects, which includes cancers like breast, gestational diabetes mellitus, and impaired neurocognitive development, fetal anomalies, and growth retardation. And therefore, this is the time to pause and think and revise our practices. So what is the role of nutrition in disease emergence? Any aberrant alteration in the dietary pattern, genetics, and epigenetic patterns may result in the disease emergence and future health of the newborn. And definitely then there is a possible role of folate and B12 imbalance in recurrent pregnancy loss through epigenetic mechanism, and it is suggested that this can be the reason for recurrent pregnancy loss. Further studies will be discussed by Dr. Manjapuri.
So I'll share some of our studies, some of our work which we have done in this regard. So this is a study in which we compared the serum folic acid, vitamin B12 levels, and homocysteine levels in women with and without recurrent pregnancy loss. So we had 107 women with recurrent pregnancy loss and 343 controls who had a good obstetric history. So we found that only 2% of the patients who had recurrent pregnancy loss were folic acid deficient. And the median folic acid level was 10.80 in the patients with recurrent pregnancy loss compared to only 2.36 in controls. So this was because of rampant use of folic acid in these patients, and the difference was statistically highly significant. At the same time, we found that 64% of the population of recurrent pregnancy loss were vitamin B12 deficient, compared to only 8% in the controls. If you look at the median value of serum vitamin B12, it was 181 compared to 313 in controls. So meaning thereby that this imbalance between overuse of folic acid in these patients and in the presence of deficiency of vitamin B12 may be a contributory factor. And if we look at the hyperhomocysteinemia, cysteine levels in these patients, say 65% of the cases had hyperhomocysteinemia compared to 20% in controls. So this difference was again statistically significantly different. So again, meaning thereby, and if you look at the median levels of plasma homocysteine, it was 16.10 compared to 8.34, and the difference was again statistically highly significant. So meaning thereby this hyperhomocysteinemia could be as a result of an imbalance between folate, high levels of folate and low levels of vitamin B12. So we concluded that folate, majority of our cases were folate replete and had statistically higher median values compared to vitamin B12 levels, wherein 64% were vitamin B12 deficient. And the odds ratio of patients who were vitamin B12 deficient of having RPL was 16.39, which was highly, highly significant. So hence we concluded that vitamin B12 deficiency was a significant risk factor for RPL in the setting of high folic acid levels. Now I share my second study in which we try to look at, does this imbalance give rise to any changes in the gene-specific methylation? So we took 85 patients of recurrent miscarriage and 121 non-pregnant controls. And we tried to look at the methylation status of the MTHFR gene. So MTHFR gene has been implicated in patients of recurrent pregnancy loss. People say that the mutation of this gene can cause recurrent pregnancy loss. However, in our population, we do not have this kind of prevalence. And however, when we looked at the methylation status, we found that the MTHFR gene was hypermethylated in cases compared to controls. So again, supporting the hypothesis that the imbalance is not healthy for women. So this is the chart which shows that the blue thing is the methylation status of the MTHFR gene in recurrent pregnancy loss, and orange is the one in controls. So our studies have been supported and are corroborate well with the work of many other people who have shown that high intake of folic acid can give rise to epigenetic alterations. So epigenetics is the bridge between genome and environment. So to conclude, the periconceptional, we missed out few slides. Oh, okay, yeah. So if I show you this slide, this is the metabolic cycle of folic acid. So if the folic acid is there and B12 is not there, then the conversion of homocysteine to methionine is actually it is trapped. So the folic acid levels rise in the blood, and they cause problems with DNA methylation and also DNA formation. So not all genes express in an individual. Factors like nutrition, stress, and environment affect gene expression. So genetic constitution may be the same, but environment would decide which ones are going to unlock and express. So this means that the old idea that genes are set in stone has been disproven. Nature versus nurture is no longer a debate. It is nearly always both. So let's have a look at this. Any woman who's carrying a female baby, and the blue thing shows her ovaries. So whatever she takes, whether it is stress, environment, high folic acid, whatever, that or smoking, it is going to affect the epigenetics of her own body and also of this baby, and also the ovaries of this baby. Now, once this baby is born, so, the ovaries are there, which are going to then bring out gametes and would then be also passing on the problem to the next generation. So it is not only intergenerational, it is also transgenerational damage which we are causing. So as obstetricians, it is our responsibility that we do not give unnecessary medications, unjustified medications to our patients. Everything should be as natural as possible, like our elders told us. So to conclude, periconceptional folic acid supplementation decreases the occurrence and recurrence of neural tube defects. It is recommended for all women planning pregnancy or capable of becoming pregnant. It should be prescribed in the right dose, 0.4 milligram per day. High dose of folic acid could be harmful both to the mother and the baby. And most of the women are folate replete and B12 deficient at booking. So an imbalance between serum folate and B12 levels can impact epigenetic programming of the fetus, resulting in fetal origin of adult disease. And we need to consider vitamin B12 supplementation if the woman is found to be vitamin B12 deficient. Thank you for patient hearing. I think we'll have the questions at the end. So now I will request Dr. Anuradha, who is an associate professor with us, to share her presentation on rudimentary horn.
Good evening all. So I'll be presenting my series on rudimentary horn, and we have miseries of inaction at primary surgery. Now, uniconnuate uterus is a rare uterine malformation with an incidence of 2.5 to 13% and constitutes about 20% of all Mullerian anomalies. And we can see in this picture, as per the American classification, it is class 2 defects, which we can see in the uniconnuate, which can be communicating, non-communicating, and it can have a cavity or it can be without the horn also. Now, rudimentary horn is associated in about 70% of the cases of uniconnuate uterus. Now, when a rudimentary horn is present, we all know that it can be cavitated, non-cavitary in 33% of the cases, or cavitary non-communicating in 22%, and cavitary communicating in 10%. Now, rudimentary horn is frequently missed clinically as well as radiologically. Misdiagnosis and inadequate treatment. Misdiagnosis and inadequate treatment of this condition can lead to catastrophic events later and, of course, a considerable long-term morbidity in women. Here we are discussing 3 cases of rudimentary horn with varied presentation, wherein there was a loss of opportunity of timely intervention during the previous surgeries of all these 3 women. Now, my first case was a 32-year-old woman. She was para-2 live 1A1 and presented to the gynae OPD with severe secondary dysmenorrhea. She was in a lot of distress, which was not relieved with medical treatment. Now, when we saw her obstetric history, she had a full-term cesarean in her first pregnancy done for breech presentation, which was uneventful. Her second pregnancy resulted in a spontaneous first trimester abortion. In her third pregnancy, she had a spontaneous rupture of uterus and she had an emergency laparotomy at around 33 weeks period of gestation with the delivery of a stillborn baby at a government hospital in Punjab. After third pregnancy, she started having a miserable, intractable secondary dysmenorrhea, although her previous menstrual cycle was absolutely normal and there was no dysmenorrhea before. In fact, she had a history of diagnostic laparoscopy, hysteroscopy, which was done for this problem only, but we do not have any details of these or the previous surgeries. On examination, she was stable. Her post speculum examination reveals that the cervix and vagina was healthy. Her vaginal examination showed the uterus was anteverted, normal side with restricted mobility, and there was a firm mass which was palpable of around 3 to 4 centimeter in the right adnexa. So a possible differential diagnosis of query endometriosis, query TO mass was made. An ultrasound was done which could not help much and it revealed a complex left adnexal mass. Now, after so much discussion and debate, we got an MRI done and this MRI showed a possibility of a functioning rudimentary horn. Now, as you can see in this picture, this was a horn which was there with the collection of blood inside, and this was a normal functional normal uterine horn which was there. Similarly, in the second picture, you can see some collection in this horn, and this was a normal cervix and the normal uterus of the normal size uterine cavity. Now, this was another picture of an MRI which showed a normal uterine cavity communicating with the vagina. The horn was not visible in this slide. Now, we took up the patient for laparohysteroscopy. Hysteroscopy revealed a normal cervical canal with an oblong uterine cavity. The left cornua was visible, but the right cornua was absent. We did a laparoscopy also. Laparoscopy revealed dense adhesions because she had previous 3 surgeries. So it was converted to laparotomy. Uterus was buried under adhesions of gut and omentum with posterior surface, fundus, and anterior abdominal wall, although the left tube and ovary was normal. Adhesiolysis was done. Uterus appeared fixed. Initially, it looked like a biconvate uterus. Right tube was thick and edematous. And when we palpated the right cornua, it appeared cystic on palpation. So here we got the thing. It was a rudimentary horn which was non-communicating. It was a broad it had a broad attachment to the uterus. Base of the horn was excised. The surgery was uneventful. Uterine wall was repaired and patient was symptom-free thereafter. In the follow-up, she conceived later on and had a full-term pregnancy. And the pregnancy carried on to full term and it was culminated, it was delivered by a cesarean section and she had a healthy baby. So in this case, we saw that the rudimentary horn remained undiagnosed despite the previous 3 surgeries she had to undergo, and look at the morbidity she faced. Despite having 3 surgeries, she could not be diagnosed with this condition and she presented as an intractable secondary dysmenorrhea. Now, to our second case, she was a 23-year-old woman and she was G2E1 who presented to our emergency with pain abdomen and ultrasound suggestive of rudimentary horn pregnancy with a unicornuate uterus. She was a known case of uterine anomaly diagnosed on laparoscopy followed by laparotomy, which was done 1 year back in some private hospital for suspected ectopic pregnancy, for which we do not had any records. So we took the patient for laparotomy because of rudimentary horn pregnancy. And to our surprise, both the tubes were normal, despite she had a history of laparoscopy, laparotomy for suspected ectopic. Right-sided, and she was carrying a right-sided rudimentary horn of 8 into 4 into 5 centimeters, which was globular in shape. Left tube and ovary was normal, right tube was tortuous. And this horn excision was done. She was treated, and she again, on follow-up, she conceived 1 year later and delivered a healthy baby at term by cesarean section. In case 3, she was a 27-year-old woman. Again, she presented to us with complaint of severe intractable secondary dysmenorrhea for 2 years. She was roaming around here and there with multiple hospitals, with multiple investigations and taken multiple courses of medicines and hormones, but she was not relieved. And the pain now became continuous for the past 3 months. Again, we looked at her obstetric history. She had an IUD delivery of an anencephalic fetus in the first pregnancy. In second pregnancy, she had a normal vaginal delivery. In her third pregnancy, she had a full-term cesarean section for breech presentation, which was again uneventful. On examination this time, the PS did not reveal anything. Pervaginum findings showed cervix was downward, uterus was anteverted and tender, and left fornix was tender, right fornix was free. Urine pregnancy test was negative. So she has got a plethora of investigations, ultrasound showing a left adnexal mass, sometimes it is ectopic, some reports gave biconvate mass. MRI also was done, which suggested left hematosalpinx with TO mass. a provisional diagnosis of, so when we evaluated her condition and her history, we thought it could be a TO mass or an endometriosis, or again, a possibility of rudimentary horn. So CECT pelvis was done, which revealed a uniconduit uterus, with rudimentary hypoplastic left horn containing blood products with complex adnexal cyst on left side. Patient was taken up for laparoscopy, which was again, unfortunately, has to be converted to laparotomy because there were dense adhesions. And perioperatively, the right wall of the uterus, right tube and ovary was normal. On the left side, there was a non-communicating rudimentary horn, which was attached to the upper part of the left side of the uterus with a lot of adhesions, and tubes and ovaries were forming a TO mass and on the left side, but right tube and ovary was normal. The mass was excised. The patient was relieved. Histopathology confirmed the diagnosis of rudimentary horn of the uterus, and patient was relieved of her symptoms. Now, we had discussed 3 cases, and we know that because of the rarity of the condition and overlap of the clinical and ultrasound findings with conditions like TO mass, diagnosis can often be missed. Diagnosis is usually made when the patient presents with complications like on all 3 cases, or we have an obstructive menstrual flow symptoms. So we should have a high index of suspicion, and early diagnosis is essential to avoid damage to our reproductive system, life-threatening complications like rupture, and of course the morbidity like we saw in our 2 cases. Clinical picture, it is usually asymptomatic, or it can be incidentally diagnosed while doing surgery. For other cases, it can lead to early onset dysmenorrhea or a severe delayed secondary dysmenorrhea like in our cases. The patient may have a history of obstetrical complication like abortions, malpresentation, which was present in our 2 cases. And they can present, or they can present directly with complications. On pelvic examination, rudimentary horn should be suspected whenever there is a marked deviation of the uterus to one side and patient is having symptoms of obstetric rudimentary horn. The investigations, 3D ultrasound and HSG are a good modality. MR imaging is the key to diagnosis, and laparohysteroscopy is of course the gold standard. Now, we had a few cases in the literature in which the patients, young patients as age of as 15 to 19 years, they had a history of appendicectomy or laparotomy, and the diagnosis of rudimentary horn was missed, and they have to undergo repeated surgeries for the correction of their primary pathology. So all the 3 patients in our case series had undergone a previous primary surgery, or in fact 3 surgeries in our first case. Emergency cesarean was done for breech in first and the third case, which is often associated with uterine malformations, and we should go on for a lookout and carefully look at all the anatomy in detail. Still, it was missed at the time of first surgery. It is evident from the first case that the rudimentary horn was not identified or even managed in the second surgery, where the patient had a ruptured uterus, and we presumed that probably the pregnancy was in a rudimentary horn only because it got ruptured at the preterm gestation, and the patient was symptomatic thereafter. In the second case, patient had a history of laparotomy for ectopic. Even then, the surgeon could not identify the anomaly. So what are the points here for discussion? Condition was either unattended or undiagnosed. Consequently, the patients were suffering, and due to the complications related to rudimentary horn, and all of them had to undergo a repeat surgery. Previously asymptomatic patients became symptomatic after an obstetric event. So this secondary amenorrhea, especially in our first case, we thought that could be possibly because of the endometrium, which has become active after pregnancy in the rudimentary horn. So what is our role? Our role is to have a high index of suspicion. We should always think of obstructive uterine anomaly as a differential diagnosis, even in Paris women in late reproductive age groups like ours, presenting to us with a secondary dysmenorrhea or pelvic pain. Rudimentary horn should be suspected, and preoperative consent for suspected uterine anomaly and a need for additional corrective surgery can be taken if required, because we are doing a common surgeries like laparohysteroscopy, or for that matter cesareans for breech presentation. We should suspect uterine anomaly, and we can take prior consent or counseling. Of course, if we are not able to have a preoperative suspicion, if the rudimentary horn is incidentally diagnosed, then post-operative counseling is essential about the need for secondary corrective surgery in cases where the rudimentary horn is diagnosed incidentally during surgery. So the take-home message is that it should be a routine for the gynecologist or any surgeon to look for the normal anatomy of the uterus, position of both the fallopian tubes, ovaries, insertion of round ligaments in any pelvic surgery, and common operations like laparotomy for ectopic, while doing a cesarean section for breech, to diagnose and manage the condition. And despite the rarity of the condition, the index of suspicion should be absolutely very high to prevent these morbidities and life-threatening complications. Thank you so much. So now I invite Dr. Piki Saxena. Ma'am is a professor in our department to give her presentations.
So over last 100 years, there have been number of innovations for glucose monitoring. In 1904, the first Benedict's reagent was discovered, and for next 50 years, it was only glycosuria, which was the only means of monitoring glycemic levels in diabetic women. Then in 1965, lab measurement of blood glucose in blood was there. In 1970, the first glucometer was discovered. And since then, we have had generations of glucometers, which are having now electronic monitoring and plasma calibrated glucometers. In 1977, HbA1c was discovered. In 1980, self-monitoring of blood glucose was recommended, and this blood glucose had to be monitored by the patient herself by using the glucometer. So this was a change from physician-led to the patient doing her own blood tests. Then 1999, the first continuous glucose monitoring device was initiated, but it was very cumbersome, costly, and difficult to analyze the interpretation. So it did not become very popular. And now in 2017, the FDA approved flash glucose monitoring system, which is a second generation of continuous glucose monitoring. And this is a revolutionary discovery, and we will be discussing about this device. So diabetes in pregnancy needs a tight control for optimal feto-maternal outcome. Therefore, glucose monitoring during pregnancy is the most important and fundamental tool for achieving normoglycemia. We are all doing SMBG, that is the self-monitoring of blood glucose, which is done by glucometer. But this provides only the snapshot of glucose at that time. Whereas this new device, which is known as the flash glucose monitoring, is a new innovation which measures the continuous glucose monitoring every 15 minutes throughout the day for 14 days, and it is easy to interpret and is user-friendly. The FGM device is being used to titrate the therapeutic interventions in patients suffering from type 1 and type 2 diabetes, but the experience in pregnant women is scanty. So earlier, we used to measure only fasting plasma glucose, postprandial, and HbA1c. But now the new concept of glycemic pentad has been introduced, and two new dimensions, the glycemic variability and hypoglycemia, have been introduced to get a holistic view of the glycemic levels. So what is glycemic variability? It is the fluctuation of glucose levels over one day. Then it is known as intraday GV, or between different days. When we compare fluctuations between different days, it is known as the interday glycemic variation. So the fluctuating glucose level, they cause increased micro and macrovascular injuries, leading to macrosomia, sudden IUD, and other complications. There was this landmark study, the Diabetes Control and Complication Trial, where they found that in spite of having same HbA1c level, the patients having a higher glycemic variability had significantly higher complications. No previous study had compared glycemic variability assessed by FGM, the flash glucose monitoring device, and the SMBG in pregnant women with diabetes. So the full name of this flash glucose monitoring device is Freestyle Libre Flash Glucose Monitoring Device. This is patented and manufactured only by the Abbott company, and it captures all the 5 dimensions of glycemia, which we just heard. And the measurement is for 14 days, and it provides both graphical presentation and the numerical values every 15 minutes. And it presents it in a form of a single day graph, and therefore we get 14 graphs for 14 days. This comes like this in a pack, and this is the sensor, which is of the size of a 10 rupee coin, which is applied to the upper outer arm with this applicator. And this is the reader. This is brought in front of the sensor, which will scan and take up all the glucose measurements which are there in the sensor. And then this is attached with the USB drive to the computer, from which we can get the graphs. So this is how the FGM graph looks like. On the x-axis, we have the timing. This is 12 midnight, 6 a.m., 12 a.m., 12 noon, 6 p.m. and 12 midnight again. We can set up the thresholds, which could be 80 or 70, which can be altered by the clinician as per the requirement, the lower one and the upper one. And this is the y-axis is the blood glucose level. So what information we get is average blood glucose. For example, in this one, it is 109. This appears to be very good control, but let us see what happens. All these time from 12 a.m. to 6 a.m., the patient is having nocturnal hypoglycemia, which will not be captured by normal SMBG. So the patient is having hypoglycemia 31% of time, and each time after breakfast, after lunch, and a bigger peak after dinner. So 24% of the time she is having hyperglycemia. So time in range is only 45%. So all these informations along with estimated HbA1c at the end of 14 days can be found by this device. But the FGM measures blood glucose and interstitial fluid, while the glucometer measures glucose levels in capillary blood. So is there any difference in the glycemic variability measured by FGM and SMBG? Can we compare the number of hypo and hyperglycemic events picked up by these methods? And what is the patient satisfaction as per these two devices? And can we really utilize these FGM device in clinical monitoring of diabetic pregnant women? So for this, we planned a prospective observational study, and we recruited 70 pregnant women with GDM, type 1 or type 2 diabetes having singleton pregnancy less than 36 weeks. All women with multiple pregnancy or having any other chronic medical illness or POG more than 36 weeks were not included in the study. Patients were recruited from the antenatal clinic or ward. SMBG and flash glucose monitoring was done for all women at the same time, and glycemic profile by both these devices was compared. Mean age of the patients was 28. Mean BMI was 23.9. We had 3 patients with type 1 diabetes, 5 with type 2, and majority 62 were gestational diabetes. When we did a comparison of corresponding glucose values measured by SMBG and FGM, we found that these values were comparable. On plotting the scatter diagram for these two devices, we found a very good correlation, and the correlation coefficient came out to be 0.891. Regarding the events of hypoglycemia, as you can see here, the FGM could detect hypoglycemia in 92.9% women, as compared to only 45.7% women in the SMBG group. That is, the SMBG group was missing nearly 50% of hypoglycemia events. In our study, all women were asymptomatic during these hypoglycemic events. In case of hyperglycemia, they were detected in 74.3% women by FGM and only 45.7% women by SMBG. Glycemic variability was also significantly higher by FGM, that is 118, as compared to only 83.2 by SMBG. As the patient satisfaction plays a key role in the treatment adherence and compliance, the patient satisfaction was assessed by using a 5-point Likert scale, with lowest score, not satisfied at all, slightly satisfied, neutral, very satisfied, and extremely satisfied. So with FGM, 68 women out of 70 were extremely satisfied, while 2 were very satisfied. In these 2 women, the sensor had come out, which was replaced by the company, but they were not very happy regarding this. While in the SMBG group, none of the women was extremely or very satisfied. 66 found it to be slightly satisfied, and 4 did not find it satisfied at all. So the reasons given for lower grading of SMBG were due to repeated pricks, anxiety, inconvenience, pain, and inconvenient timing of SMBG. So regarding the clinical utility. So this is the first case in which the patient with GDM who was controlled on medical nutrition therapy was, when we applied this FGM device to her, we found intraday and interday glycemic variability. So I will just explain in a moment. SMBG graph, if you see here, all the values are within normal limit. But when we see the FGM graph here, we find that the time is target is only 57%, although the average glucose level is 102. The time in hypoglycemia, the nocturnal hypoglycemia and hypoglycemia before meal is 22%, and hyperglycemia after breakfast, after lunch, after tea, and after dinner comprises of 21%. When we modulated and titrated the diet, the average blood glucose levels increased still within normal limit, but the time and target increased from 57 to 86. The time in hypoglycemia reduced from 22% to only 1%, and time in hyperglycemia also reduced significantly. This was another patient with GDM who was controlled on insulin and medical nutrition therapy. Again, her SMBG records were absolutely normal. But here we see that although the average blood glucose is 98, time in target is only 48%, time in hypoglycemia is 33%, and time in hyperglycemia is 18%. After titrating insulin and diet, the average glucose levels remained same, but the time in target nearly doubled, 88% of the time. And hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia reduced significantly. This is another interesting case of type 1 diabetes when the patient developed vomiting and went into diabetic ketoacidosis. This I've just put so that you can get an idea how the FGM graph looks like at the time of ketoacidosis. More than 90% of the time, she was having hyperglycemia. Average blood glucose was 325. The levels were as high as 500, but this graph measures levels only up to 350. But the numerical readings which we obtained from FGM device measured the accurate levels. The FGM, the other advantage is that in one day, it measures 95 readings as compared to maximum of 7 readings by SMBG. And usually we are doing only 4 readings. So over 14 days, 1330 readings we get by FGM device as compared to 98 with 7 times reading and 56 by SMBG done 4 times. The other advantages are that the optimal timing of postprandial hyperglycemia varies according to the food composition, and hence a single SMBG measurement can miss the highest peak. The advantage with FGM is that the post-meal hyperglycemia can be seen as a continuum. And in our study, we found the peak occurred 60 to 90 minutes after meal. The other potential of FGM in COVID-19 is the most important one. The graphic representation of FGM is easy to understand, interpret, store, and then share through email or smartphone. Therefore, FGM can be a very useful tool for facilitating telemedicine during COVID-19 pandemic by reducing exposure or contact time during travel, and also contact with the multiple physicians, the obstetricians, physicians, nutritionists, and the neonatologists by decreasing the time in physical contact. To conclude, mean glucose levels measured by SMBG and FGM show good agreement. Based on the robust data generated through this study, FGM is a better tool for detecting glycemic variability, detecting the exact number and duration of asymptomatic and nocturnal hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia events, which may be missed by SMBG. This useful information, when downloaded every day, can be correlated with meals, exercise, or insulin therapy on a daily basis, which will guide to modify the therapeutic interventions and dietary habits. This can be a very effective educational tool and allows the woman with diabetes to understand how her day-to-day decisions will impact the glycemic control and motivate her to take charge of her general health. FGM has the advantage of higher patient satisfaction as compared to SMBG by avoiding recurrent picking, inconvenience, pain, and anxiety. And another thing is that many times we have seen that pregnant women with diabetes having an apparently normal glucose level suddenly land up in an IUD. So this FGM may give deeper insights of these silent episodes of hypo and hyperglycemia, which may be missed by SMBG and may be responsible for adverse pregnancy outcome like IUD and macrosomia. Our result the findings of our study also corroborated with these other studies. And at the end, I would like to acknowledge the help we received from the Delhi Diabetic Forum, the financial assistance we received for procuring the FGM sensors and supporting this study.
Thank you, Dr. Picky. That was indeed a wonderful presentation. The question answers, there are some in the chat. Is there anybody from your team taking up the question answers, or shall I take them?
Kanika, the ones which were in the chat, I have already answered them. And
Okay.
if there are any others, I think you can take them. That should be okay.
Dr. Sagar is asking, what is the cost of this flash glucose monitoring system?
Yeah, the sensor costs about 2,000 rupees. And this is the sensor. And this is very small and it lasts for 14 days. And this costs only 2,000 rupees to the patient. While this is the reader, this costs 5,000 rupees and it is given only to the consultants or the specialists. This is not provided to the patient. So the patient after 14 days or whenever in between the patient wants to come, she need not do the SMBG. She can come to the doctor who can take a picture and generate the graphs and decide the insulin level or alter the medical nutrition therapy as per the graph records.
Dr. PK, how it is fixed to the skin?
Ma'am, there is a small adhesive patch here and there is a small needle. I think you will not be able to see. I cannot also see it. It is 0.4 millimeters thick only. So it is just stuck here on the upper outer arm. And the patient can take bath, she can go out. It has been even tested about 100 meters below sea level. And she can stay there for 30 minutes and still it works. So it does not cause any inconvenience to the patient. And it is being used routinely now by the physicians. So I thought, why not use it in the gynae profession also? It may be very useful for obstetrics practice if we use this in our clinical practice.
Yeah, Dr. Picky, I just wanted to know that have you spoken to some diabetologists who have used this flash glucometer? Because, our doctors who are using it here are not very happy with the sensitivity. No, like, have you had any personal experience of talking to people?
Actually, has been used by our colleagues in the physicians and the endocrinologists.
Right.
And as I showed in the last slide, the other studies also corroborate our findings that it is very useful in managing clinical day-to-day management. And one paper from Sashaya et al. From our country has again shown it in diabetic pregnant patients and other diabetic patients who have again found it to be an excellent tool for measuring.
Basically what I wanted to understand is that it correlates well with the glucometer readings, does it?
Yes. Yeah, that is what we have shown in the study.
This is what she has shown.
Correlation is very good between the SMBG. Nearly 90% correlation is there.
Okay, because practically, I think, I don't know, maybe that is something we need
Dr.
to look
Rinku,
at.
I have two questions, ma'am.
Yeah.
My first question is for case 1. As you have said that the routine dose should be only 4,000 microgram. So only because 5 milligram tablet is available. So ma'am, what is your suggestion? Should the new preparation be made for 4,000 microgram or how to adjust this dose?
Actually, Dr. Kanika is here. She's done a research on this and she says, Kanika, you can give an answer to that.
So there are preparations available, ma'am. There are 400 microgram and 1 milligram tablets available in the market. So 100 microgram tablet, if you purchase, it costs ₹6 per tablet. And 1 milligram tablet, around 64 tablets come of 100 rupees. So it's like around 0.6 rupees per tablet.
Is it available in government supply also? Because what we are getting is only 5 milligram tablet.
No, Shashi, you are right. It is not available in the government supply. So what I do is I give half a tablet every alternate day.
Okay.
So, instead of that 5 milligram,
that's a better option.
Yeah. So I
feel that this should be made a recommendation only.
Yeah, I think we should make a guideline about this.
So
that it can be communicated to Government of India.
We have communicated it to the government and we are in a dialogue. And we feel that 0.5 milligram tablet should be available. So they are getting on board and let's see what happens. Yeah.
And ma'am, one more question. Do you advise initial folate level when the patient comes in early first trimester?
No, we don't do it. It is not cost effective, but at least you can stop giving that 5 milligram folate unnecessarily. That is the only message which I wanted to give.
Okay. Yeah.
Ma'am, I have a question to ask.
Yeah.
For the second case presentation, like
Yes,
whenever we find the rudimentary horn in an asymptomatic patient as accidental finding when we are doing a surgery for either cesarean or ectopic, so do we need to do any intervention at that time?
Ma'am, because the patient is under anesthesia and we probably most of the time we have not taken consent. So it is not ethical actually to do the procedure, but we can also
ethically it is not right.
counseling, ma'am, regarding the surgery. which is required.
Dr. Anuradha.
Like in your particular cases, when you said that when the patient was operated, even at that time, it was probably missed or overlooked and nothing was done. So patient had to have a re-laparotomy, third time probably, just to, give the treatment. So recommendation again, but there is an ethical issue, right?
Yeah, ma'am, the post-operative counseling was not. We were not aware.
I would request
Dr. Anuradha, I have one question for the second case.
Because we would.
Yes, ma'am, please.
Yeah. See, you
Dr.
said
Thakur,
that
can you have
what
your
is,
video on?
according to your experience, which is the best imaging modality for diagnosing a rudimentary horn? Because sometimes it was missed in ultrasound, sometimes in CT scan, sometimes in MRI. So what do you think according to your experience?
All the MRI is the most sensitive one, where we can get an idea about the rudimentary horn. It also differentiates it from the adenomyosis or endometriosis. So MRI, I think, it should be the modality of choice if required.
Can I just give a comment on this? I
Yes,
remember I was a senior resident in Maulana Azad, and Dr. Chadda, Pramila Chadda gave me such a firing when I left a rudimentary horn, and she said, "Why did you not ligate the tube?" So, in case you are doing a cesarean for breech, I think that we should expect that there, and especially primary, we should expect there was going to be a malformation. So maybe we can do a counseling beforehand. So that is one thing.
But always keep in mind.
Yeah, and secondly, when we do a laparoscopy, we already have a hysterosalpingiography which shows a banana shape, cavity. So we should suspect that there is a rudimentary horn. We should do that counseling prior to that and try to finish, in case it is a kind of a pedunculated kind of thing, then you can remove it. Otherwise, at least we should ligate the tube. That's what is my understanding.
So the carry-home message is that the pre-operative counseling, especially in the primary malpresentations, that there may be a probability and we might need to do some sort of intervention.
High index of suspicion.
That is the best message we can convey.
High index of suspicion and anticipation.
It was an excellent presentation of all the cases.
Thank you,
Excellent
sir.
presentation.
Is there any question from Dr. Rekha? Dr. Rekha Bharti?
Kanika, most of the questions are answered, and as usual, I must congratulate Dr. Manju for excellent clinical meeting. And we all know all the cases were so much relevant and they were so interesting, and so much of the facts were brought in. And thank you, ma'am, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Ma'am, I want to say something, Dr. Manjupuri, ma'am. I really feel so privileged and proud to share the platform, and so frequently these days. You used to be my teacher and I used to be so scared of you. But I feel so proud that today it's all because of your teachings only that I am able to stand beside you. Thanks to you.
No, I'm very, very.
I'm learning so much.
Students, I'm really.
I remember those days, ma'am, when I used to be in labor room as a resident and you used to be my professor, and each drop of Cinto you used to count for me. It's all privilege to me, and Kanika also remembers everything.
Dr. Manjupuri was my teacher also, but I don't remember her as scolding us that
I
way.
wanted to share this with ma'am, and
wonderful working with her.
So frequently with ma'am.
Thank you so much.
The judges are my classmates, Rekha and Rinku. Both of them are my classmates. I did senior residency with Vinita, and obviously Dr. Manju was our mentor. So we are all her products.
Every day we are learning from Dr. Manju, ma'am.
Thank you.
Another question from some anonymous attendee: is such a tight glycemic control safe for the fetus?
So we are not talking about a tight glycemic control. The levels of sugar between 95 to 140 is absolutely okay. So there is no need to have a very tight control. But what we are scared of is the hypoglycemic event. Okay, the hypo and the hypers, the glycemic fluctuation, the variability, that is coming up as the root cause. Because as we discussed in the case, the blood glucose levels may be normal, within normal range. But if the fluctuation is too much, there is oxidative stress that may lead to all the complications to the baby or to the mother and other target organs.
And I feel that
The question,
big advantage with this flash glucose monitoring, that the patient can get her own feedback.
Yeah.
And to know that what you are eating, and then they can't tell us lies. No, मैं तो नहीं खाती हूँ. So you all that
Compliance can
right.
also be checked.
The whole day long. Yeah.
Compliance can be checked. At
Yeah.
present, it is available only with the doctor. Only the doctor has the reader, but soon it is going to be made available to the patient herself, so that they can use it at home at their own convenience.
Charging only, charging kharab hai.
yeah, another question from Dr. Rinku. Are we doing any studies for considering routine B12 in pregnancy and routine supplementation of B12 in pregnancy?
Yeah, we are actually trying to, move a project with DPT and also with UK team, MRC. And they are also very keen to look at this folic acid and B12 imbalance in view of epigenetic aberrations. So we are, we are trying to get on with that project. Yeah, definitely. Yes.
Dr. Manju, I just want to ask one question. You said tubal ligation should be done in case a rudimentary horn is found during a cesarean section. But even in my personal experience, I had a case. She was previous to LACS with ruptured uterus. I opened up. It was basically this time the pregnancy was in the rudimentary. And we were thinking the main uterus has ruptured, and we removed the rudimentary. But in rudimentary horn, it's better to remove the tube because of the transperitoneal migration of the ova. Even if you ligate the tube, she can have a topic. No, so I was regretting that I should have removed the tube. No. I forgot to remove the tube.
No, you have a very, very valid question. And the comment is absolutely valid. It is a, open-ended dilemma. So once you interrupt the tube, if you interrupt the tube, then at least rudimentary horn pregnancy would not happen.
Yeah.
It's part one. Part two is that in case we do a salpingectomy, then there would be a concern about the vascularity to the ovary.
Blood supply, yeah.
You take a call, I'm to say, you have to.
But I was in my mind, I should have removed the tube. At that time, I forgot to remove the tube. I just removed the horn.
No, if you have
better for the younger one.
No, if you have removed the horn, it is fine. I'm to say, then it is fine. Yeah,
it's fine. But in this case, they can be because of transperitoneal.
It can have a topic in the tube. That way it can be.
Because here it is there. Cervix, usually there is no. The problem is there because it's open outside.
But I remember my Dr. Pramila Chedda giving me a full firing on this. Leave that. So
there will be no pregnancy in the rudimentary horn. It will just be the tube, not in the rudimentary.
Yes.
Which is more dangerous.
Yeah.
So I think we move on. It is my honor and privilege to be proposing this vote of thanks for the last time in my tenure as Vice President on behalf of AOGD. So I thank Dr. Manju Puri and her team LHMC for their excellent, unusual and out-of-box presentations. The indiscriminate use of folic acid supplementation presented by Dr. Kanika Chopra, that was really good. It actually opens our vision so that that we should monitor the folic acid if possible and not just supplement it, especially the dose that we are giving routinely, and B12 needs to be monitored more, especially in vegetarians. Then the second case presentation by Dr. Anuradha Singh, we should have our antennas open for the possibility of a rudimentary horn in such cases of severe secondary dysmenorrhea. And a post-op counseling, as she said, is very important in such cases of incidental finding during cesarean section when we cannot take the consent from the patient, the bleeding may be more, and maybe she can be counseled for a post-operative removal of the horn. And the third case presented by Dr. Picky Saxena of flash glucose monitoring is an eye-opener. That's a very recent and a very good gadget that she showed. And it should be, I think, open to all and used more frequently. And nothing can be better than this kind of monitoring for a pregnant patient. So excellent presentations. Thank you, Team LHMC. And I would like to thank our judges for the day, Dr. Shashilata Kabra, Dr. Rekha Bharti, Dr. Rinku Singh Gupta, and Dr. Vinita Gupta for their valuable inputs and sparing their time to judge this session. And I would like to thank all the viewers, and I would request them to stay logged in, because now we would be having a virtual handover ceremony of the AOGD to Team Saptajang and Dr. Achla Batra. And I would like to thank the Jacksonpal team, Dr. Deepika, Dr. Gatin.
I'm so happy. I was hearing the cases and it looked so fantastic. And Manju, you have done a very excellent job. And I want to congratulate you for taking over as a head. I of course, I knew very late, but it's a great. It's so pleasant to see you on the chair.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am.
So I hand over to Dr. Mala Srivastava for the day's proceedings.
Thanks, Dr. Kanika. Today is a great occasion for us at Gangaram Hospital as we hand over the Secretariat of AOGD virtually to Dr. Achla Batra, who is the incoming president, and her team from Safdarjung Hospital. We at Gangaram really enjoyed our tenure as Secretariat of AOGD, and we really learned a lot during this 1 year. We tried to work best, very hard, best of our capacity, and we all tried to come up to the expectation of all the members of AOGD. I welcome Dr. Achla Batra, the president of AOGD 2021-2022. Over to you, Dr. Achla, for your evening's proceeding.
Thank you, Mala. Good evening to everyone, and I must begin by congratulating Mala for her excellent work during this COVID year. She has taught us, that in spite of everything, we can go on, and she's laid the path for us to take AOGD to greater heights, which I hope we will be able to do with all your supports. And, whatever we do, it has to be a teamwork. So let me introduce my team. Of course, you all are my team, and but the team who's going to work, from Safdarjung, I want to introduce that team. So can you all see my slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so the AOGD 21-22, we have a theme of promoting women's health by strong will and quality skill. So for this, I have my team who is my strength, my family, my friends. They're all, and all of you are also my team. First of all, let me begin with my mentor and my advisor for AOGD, Dr. Patma Mittal. You all know her. She has brought laurels to AOGD when she was president, and she had attained great, goals when as a vice president of FOXI. So under her advice and leadership, we will continue to take AOGD to greater heights. Vice President, Dr. Jyotsna Suri, you all know her, a very academic, a very charming and helpful person. She never says no to anyone. And I'm not going to let her be my stepney, that when I'm not there, she's going to work shoulder to shoulder with me and do everything. Then I have my young, enthusiastic, bubbly, active secretary, Monica, who is going to do all the donkey's work with the help of her able joint secretaries, Divya and Anita. But the most important person who holds the purse of the AOGD is the treasurer. For that, I have Dr. Upma, a very meticulous person who is going to keep the records so straight that I don't think I'll have any problem. And she's going to be helped by Dr. Ritu. The pillar of academics is the scientific committee. We have a very, very helpful head of the department in Safdarjung Hospital who let us do whatever we want to do, because we are a lot of people senior to her in the department, but she is very cooperative, never, interferes, always lends a helping hand. And Dr. Anand, Dr. Rupali Diwan, they all are ex-head of departments. And Dr. Sunita Malik, you all know, Dr. Vijay Joshi, Dr. Sonam, Dr. Harsha, Dr. Bindu Bajaj, Dr. Sarita, and Dr. Garima. They are going to be the scientific committee. The most difficult and daunting task, I think, in the AOGD is bringing out that monthly AOGD bulletin, which has to be good. And that will be done by Dr. Rekha Bharti with her co-editors, Dr. Archana Mishra, Dr. Shiba Marwa, Dr. Soumya Prasad. Rekha is, very hardworking. I mean, I'm yet to see anybody who is so hardworking, and she takes the load off everybody. She works so hard and she's so meticulous, and all her co-editors are also very good and very, very enthusiastic. So they will bring you a treat every month. Dr. Sumitra Bachani, she's our web editor, a very, very artistic person. She's a poetess, she paints, and I think she will give a new shape to the website. And she's going to be helped by equally creative Dr. Sarita Singh and Nishi Chaudhary. A very important task of AOGD is, coordinating all the, not only the monthly meetings, but the CMEs, which I have given to Dr. Renu Arora. She was also our ex-HOD, because we have so many seniors. I'm so, privileged to have so many senior people to help me. And she will be held by Dr. Usha, Dr. Sujata, and Dr. Deepti. For any organization to work, you have to have good public relation. And we have a very efficient public relation committee, Dr. Sunita Yadav, Dr. Yamini, and Dr. Kavita Agarwal. So I invite now Monica to speak about our theme. Monica, over to you.
Thank you, Achla. And thanks to all my seniors and our Chief Advisor, Pratima Ma'am, for entrusting me with the responsibility of being the secretary of the committee. I hope I can live up to all your expectations. As you said, the theme for our AOGD this year would be promote women's health by strong will and quality skill. And why we kept this theme is because under the strong will, we would be undertaking two major tasks of cancer screening throughout all over Delhi and NCR, and adolescent health, promotion of adolescent health program. And quality skill, why? Because we would be, liaising with the FOXI for Manyata program for accreditation of the peripheral centers and even the private setups for their accreditation for obstetric care and, in accordance to the Government of Health programs. And of course, last but not the least, critical care, where we are regularly anyways holding the programs to provide skills to one and all. And for these four major tasks, like for cancer screening, we'll be holding awareness programs all over. And the team which has been, given this task will be led by Dr. Sunita Malik, who all of you know is the oncology subcommittee chairperson for this term. Dr. Vijay Joshi, who has been the past president of IFSCCP. And Dr. Sarita Shamsundar, who is the current president and is also the organizing chairperson of the World Congress later this year. Then we have the programs for adolescent health. This team would be led by under the able guidance of Dr. Pratima Mittal, because she has been in the team of the trainer of trainers for adolescent health educators. And we will be, holding on to, we will be organizing various school programs and trainings, online trainings. And this team will be led by Dr. Sujata Das under the able guidance of Dr. Pratima Mittal. Then we have, and Dr. Sujata Das is also the co-chairperson for the adolescent AOGD subcommittee, as we all know. So thus this task has been aptly given to them. Then, as I said, Manyata program to be liaising with FOXI and their other already prevalent programs. Dr. Achla Batra will be mainly coordinating this with the team leader as Dr. Anjali Dabral, who's our head of the department of Safdarjung Hospital. And this is how, and we'll be probably creating teams in the periphery, in the private sector, in the clinics, in the setups, and accordingly we'll come out with a floor plan for what we plan to do. And last but not the least, as I said, critical care. You all know Dr. Jyotsna Suri, who's in charge of our critical care department in Safdarjung Hospital, and also our vice president for AOGD. She'll be leading this program by her chosen team, and all the details will subsequently reach to all the AOGD members.
So thank you, Monica. I would just want, Dr. Pratima to just give us few words of advice, which she's going to give us throughout the year, but to begin it today. Dr. Pratima, please.
Thank you, Achla. First of all, I would like to congratulate Mala and her team, Mala Srivastav and her team, for doing such an excellent work. Congratulations, Mala, and we are really proud to be, having worked in such difficult circumstances, challenging circumstances, but you did a wonderful job, and I think the conference which you held, I think that will be always remembered. Very nicely done.
Thanks.
So, and next I will congratulate Dr. Achla. I think we really had a healthy competition. We had done a, voting started for the first time in AOGD on the digital platform. And I mean, it made things look so easier. But I really congratulate you for winning with hands down. And secondly, I'm sure the theme is very, very appropriate in today's era, and we are going to do very good. And I have always told my team, always told that we should opt for the maximum input from all the stalwarts, and as well as we will go for we should go that we will do the excellent job by taking the best society prize. So Mala, I also want you to apply for that and go for it, and then we will also try for that. That's what I feel, and definitely we are going, this team is going to do very well. I'm very confident about it, and congratulations to Monica and Dr. Achla for the whole thing, and Dr. Jyotsna.
Thank you, Pratima. I would want my vice president, who's going to shoulder all the responsibilities with me, to just say a few words, how she's going to help me.
Thank you, ma'am. So a very good evening to all my respected seniors and to my dear colleagues and friends. Today it's a very auspicious day when we at Safdarjung take over the mantle of our beloved AOGD from Team Gangaram, who really deserve a standing ovation for the way they have conducted the AOGD. All the activities during this challenging time, as already mentioned by Madam Pratima Mittal and by Dr. Achla also. So I think under the dynamic leadership of Dr. Mala Srivastav, the Vice President, Dr. Kanika, and Dr. Mamta, Secretary, and both the editors, Dr. Geeta and Dr. Chandra, they have all done a wonderful job. So our work is already, we hope that we can live up to those standards and do much more also, I hope, with support of everybody. And AOGD is much more than 4 words, I think. It is the inspiration, and I think it is the pride of all the gynecologists of Delhi. So we really thank all of you to bestow, give this, responsibility, think that you thought us worthy, our team at Safdarjung, to live up to this, to look after our AOGD. And we wish that we hope and we will nurture it with love, sincerity, dedication, and all our best effort. So thank you, everyone. And I hope that all the members of AOGD will take active part in all the activities which have been chalked out by our president, which Monica has just read out. So we would, really look forward to the active participation of each and every one of our members. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jyotsna. So I think with the blessing of our seniors and cooperation from all of you, and I'm going to interest, all the leaders who are there having various, organizations in different names, but they're all part of AOGD. So they will be interested with the task of what 4 things we are going to do, all of them, so that whatever we do goes all over the Delhi, and we, become even stronger in Foxy, and our name is taken by pride that the best society of Foxy is AOGD. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mala, and congratulations once again, Mala, Kanika, Mamta, Geeta, and everybody else who have done such commendable work. Over to you, Mala.
Thanks, Dr. Achla, and thanks, Madam Pratima, Madam, for all your encouragement and appreciation. And I think we are looking forward for a great year ahead with all the academic activities and all the CMEs that we are going to lined up. And as you planned it's a very good planning for you and a very good theme that is awaiting us for the next year. Thanks and all the best to the Safdarjung team under the leadership of Dr. Achla Batra and Dr. Jyotsna Suri. Thanks everyone, and thanks Madam Puri, Dr. Manju Puri, for excellent AOGD monthly meeting. With this, we come to the end of this meeting. Thanks everyone.
Good day.
We need to clap for you, Mala. Well done.
Thanks. And all the best to the incoming team. Very good.
Excellent bulletins and excellent term. Very, very well done. And all the best, Achla.
Thank you, Manju. You are going to be my team, and
yeah, we are all with you, Dr. Achla.
Yeah, you have to be
working together.
Yes.
Delhi has to be the best. Yeah.
Yes.
Delhi has to be
Our AOGD team has to be the best.
Yes.
Absolutely.
That is the motto.
Congratulations, Dr. Achla, and your strong team. I hope
Thank you.
You will be just first one for the Foxy, and you will show that the AOGD is the best AOGD is the best one.
Thank you so much for your
best
wishes.
society. We are the best society. We're the biggest
That
society.
should be-
We are the best.
It is the
Delhi
biggest
society is the
society, and everybody is scared of Delhi society.
Yes.
In Foxy, I'm telling you. So you keep your foot down like this, that everybody has to come to Delhi to find out and take the support.
Yes. Yes, with help from everybody, all the members of AOGD.
We are all together, Dr. Achla. We are with you.
Yes,
So
yes.
3 cheers for Mala and 3 cheers for Achla.
Thank you.
Thanks, ma'am. Thanks, ma'am.
We would also like to thank from Jackson Pal, all the attendees and all the experts here. And thanks to Dr. Mala and the AOGD team of Safdarjung, with whom we had been working the whole year, last year, helping with the monthly clinical meetings. And we hope to go the same way with Dr. Achla Batra, ma'am, with the Safdarjung. Thank you very much. And there's a small product video that we would like to play at the end now.